Ian, thank you very much for joining us. So let's kick off with your career. How did you get into the IT sector?
Well, accidentally.
Yeah.
I first got interested in information technology when I was doing my officer training at OTU Skyville. And funnily enough, at the same time as Tim Fisher.
Right.
Tim was in my grade. There's another famous Skyvillian was a fellow called Jeff Kennett.
Right.
But he was a junior classmate, so he had to stand up when I came in the room.
Right.
So one of the interesting things about the Vietnam War was that it was one of the first wars where electronic warfare started to play a part. We're all familiar, of course, with the cybersecurity issues of the Second World War because of the Enigma machine.
Absolutely.
Churingsworth at Bletchley. And interestingly enough, of course, Trevor Pearcey also served at Bletchley, as did my father. But my father wasn't allowed to talk about it for quite a few years afterwards.
Yeah.
So I got interested from that viewpoint, but nothing much happened until I was in Army Aviation. I was going to be a helicopter pilot. My foot got smashed up in an exercise, and so I came out of the military. One of the first jobs that I then got was at a place called Fibre Makers, which is a division of ICI, and I started off in stock control and then moved into the computer room, firstly as an operator and then as a trainee, what they call systems programmer in those days.
Sure.
And worked with a very clever fellow called David Grills, who was leading the charge. And David and I, between us, managed to produce the first multifunction tasking version of the 36040,
Right.
IBM 36040. And IBM said it was impossible with 128K to play with.
Right.
However, we did it. So one of the interesting things I think about Australian software, especially in the early stages, was Australian software developers were often told that it was completely impossible to do something, or that nobody had ever done it, and so that's why we did it.
Right.
And a lot of Australian software breakthroughs took place on kitchen tables with people who were told they couldn't do it.
Right.
So we have a proud history in the software industry. From Fibre Makers, I went to Associated Steamships as a programmer, became an analyst programmer, and went to Australian National Line. A&L, I worked on the first online shipment reservation network in Australia.
Okay. Yeah.
Was on loan to IBM, and it ran on a thing called Call 360, which is essentially a very early cloud-based facility.
Yep.
To give you an indication of how slow and torturous it was, however, the fastest line that we could get between Melbourne and Sydney ran at 1600 baud.
Right. Yes.
A baud being one character.
Yes.
Second.
Yeah.
And so we had to run a reservation network that would work at 1600 baud satisfactorily, which it managed to do.
Right.
One of the interesting stories about that, of course, was that being a government-owned organisation, Australian National Line was a bit conservative.
Certainly.
And one of the things they were very concerned about was passengers on the Princess of Tasmania or Empress of Australia,
Right.
who were illegally cohabiting.
Oh. Right.
And so we had to write some code which stopped people who didn't have the correct surnames from being in the same cabin together.
Right.
Which caused a bit of a problem when Senator Wright, otherwise known as Bully Wright, the Senator for Tasmania, wanted to travel from Melbourne to Sydney in the Princess of Tasmania with his daughter in the same cabin.
Right.
And he got stopped.
Right.
I got called in at 2 o'clock in the morning to write a code bypass just so that we could get the tickets out on time.
Yeah.
Okay, from Australian National Line, I went to Cigna Business Systems, which is an offshoot of ICL, or actually purchased by ICL later. Produced a computer called the System 10, which was basically assembler based. And we were hired in Melbourne. We were told to go out and install this system and make it work, but we didn't actually have a copy of the operating system.
Right.
So one of my first jobs was to do a core dump of the entire operating system and then decode it by hand
Oh, so
to try and work out how the bloody thing worked.
right.
Now, the good thing about that was I did learn how it worked quite well,
Yeah.
and went from Cigna to a company called George Kinnear and Sons, which was a rope works in Footscray,
Okay.
as
Yeah.
assistant DP manager there. And whilst there, I was fed up with the fact that backups were taking 47 minutes a disk.
Right.
So I went back into the caught up stuff that I'd done years ago and worked out that the cycle time on a 6-cylinder disk was 1.3 milliseconds, and therefore worked out how to transfer the head movements in such a way that it would run in cylinder mode rather than the surface mode, which cut the disk transfer time down from 47 minutes to 8.
All right.
So I could actually run the whole disk transfer and then validate it by running it again and comparing
Yeah.
in less time than it had originally taken to do the whole thing.
Right. Excellent.
I called this thing COPAC, for copying packs.
Right.
Made the mistake of getting a copy to the system engineers who came around to look at it. And the next thing I knew, a software product called PackOp was released worldwide by Cigna Business Systems,
Right.
without a single cent of thanks or acknowledgement or royalties coming back to me.
Yeah.
Incensed by this, I thought this is not right, so took up the cause of software copyright, because
right.
at that stage there was no software copyright in
Right.
Australia. All we had to rely on was patent law,
Yes.
and of course you were told that you couldn't patent software. So started that campaign, and by that stage I'd left Fibre Makers and gone to started my own software company in my back garden.
Yeah.
And Fibre Makers becoming my first client, so they were very happy to keep me on. And flowing out of that, we basically fought the copyright issue, managed to get to the stage where we found a loophole in the system where aids to manufacture for people who manufactured things got a sales tax redemption.
Right.
And so I postulated the idea that if we manufactured software, then therefore the machines that we used in order to manufacture it, we should get the sales tax back on what we paid for it.
Right.
And since in those days a machine might cost $100,000 and you might sell $20,000 worth of software from development,
Yeah.
the sales tax redemption was actually worth more than the software product.
Right.
We got to the point where we formed the Australian Software Houses Association, basically to fight that issue.
Right.
And in fact, one of the first companies that got clobbered by software sales tax when they introduced it was a company run by the guy who later became a chairman of the AAA.
Right.
But at that stage, he was just running a little software company in Doncaster, a fellow called John Guider.
Right.
Anyway, we took the matter up with the tax department. I remember meeting with the tax department in Canberra and basically saying, well, hang on, this is actually costing you more money than you're collecting. Have you had a look at your collection costs as well? And the next thing I know, an assistant commissioner of taxation basically said to me, we're going to clobber this because it's costing us too much money.
Right.
And so we won.
Right.
We got it accepted that while software was subject to sales tax, services weren't at
Yes.
that particular stage,
Yeah.
and we were entitled to aids to manufacture.
Right.
Flowing on from forming ASHA for this purpose, we decided, well, we can influence policy, and maybe this is the way to go about it.
Yeah.
At that stage, the what is now the AAA was called the Australian Computer Equipment Suppliers Association, ACS.
Okay. So.
And I think they were starting to realise that just representing international suppliers was not getting them the audiences they wanted.
Yeah.
There was another body called the Australian Computer Equipment Manufacturers Association, headed up by George Kepper and Damien Dunlop. And so they were pushing the manufactured here barrow.
Right.
And of course, Akiza was getting slightly sidelined by us squeezing from the software side and Akima pushing from the Australian manufacturer side.
Right.
So they started a move towards merger. And Akima agreed to go in. Another group in Sydney called the Australian Computer Suppliers Association, headed up by Peter Draney, also agreed to merge with the AAA.
Yeah.
And So we decided to take a slightly different track. There was already a software industry association as part of the Australian Computer Society, headed up by Carl Reid.
Right.
And so Carl and I got together and decided we'll bring the SIA and ASHA together to form the Software and Services Industry Federation of Australia.
Yeah.
Because that way we've got a much better reach, and also because half of what was coming out of an ACS initiative, it had a lot more support from the ACS. And so CIFA was formed and became, got the EFIC status with the Austrade. So we then started the process of developing software missions out of Australia to take Australian software to the world.
Right.
The first mission was, unofficial mission was to Singapore. I remember Carl and I led that.
Yeah.
And the first thing we had to do was make sure Carl had a haircut before we actually got to Singapore, because in those days
That's right, colour length.
it was very difficult.
Yes. Yeah.
The first official mission, however, went to Japan a couple of years later, and managed to get a Guernsey on that. And flowing from that particular mission was the start of the discussions which led to the formation of ASOCIO, the Asian Oceanian Computer Industry Organisation. And ASOCIO was a bit of a trailblazer because it was the first Asian Australasian grouping. So while we had situations where SIARC was starting to talk to the ACS, ASEAN definitely wasn't. And ASOCIO had both Australia and New Zealand as full members from day one, but the Americans were not admitted. So for the first time, Australia and New Zealand had a foot at the table with the major Asian Oceanian Computer Industry Organisation, which had enough substance to actually include both the PRC and Taipei.
Right.
But it was only allowed to be called China Taipei. It could not be called Republic of China. So, but we worked on the assumption that the international linkages were far more important than the political nonsenses that we'd all grown up with. So ASOCIO struck new ground in terms of international relationships for us. A little while after that, my first software company, by the way, was called Logical Computer Systems.
Right.
I rather liked that because it suggested that all other computer systems were illogical.
Yes. Right.
But it was a bit cheeky, but it ran very well. We did a lot of work on System 10s and things of that nature. Ran that for a while. Quite successfully. Got to the stage of operations in Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, New Zealand. And then the usual situation occurs when you set a company up and you're much better at driving company growth than you are at running them.
Sure.
And so I had a fallout with the board, and I still can't remember whether I quit or they fired me. But anyway, I walked out the door. Yeah. And about 6 months later, started the first Whitehorse company.
Right.
And because the interesting thing was 2.5 years later, the directors of Logical came to me and said, please, could you take it back for nothing?
Right.
Because they'd managed to drive it into the ground and lose everything. Mind you, half the clients, of course, came across the Whitehorse anyway, so Whitehorse had good grounding from day one. Whitehorse ran for basically for 30 odd years. Yeah. I had one interlude in that where I went and worked for Ernst Winnie, initially under contract. Yeah. And then as Director of Strategic Market Development, which I thought was a title I invented myself. And then when Ernst Winnie and Arthur Young merged, they merged at midnight on the 30th of June, based on a vote in London. Right. In order to safeguard my contract, the Ernst Winnie guys gave me a salaried appointment. So I was the last person worldwide hired by Ernst & Winnie, or the first person worldwide to work for Ernst & Young, whichever way around you want to do it. Yeah. And I found out the other day. That's actually my profile from the Ernst & Young days. Yeah. I was a little younger then. Yes. And that photo was untouched. Yeah. That's a So flowing on from the software industry stuff, within the Ernst & Young camp, I managed to persuade them that my major area of business was developing export for Australian software, and Austrade was our primary client. So we set up the Australian Information Industry Centre in Europe, which ran for about 2 years, I think.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of work then in Berlin with the European Software Centre, and during that period got both EU and United Nations accreditation, UNCTAD-GATT for the UN and the EU DG13 as a attested expert in export and that sort of stuff. Anyway, I enjoyed that for a while, but then felt like going back into software again. So I got RSI, as a matter of fact, and had to go into hospital for major back surgery. So I quit Ernst & Young, recovered from the back surgery, and then the first thing that happened was that somebody at Dewsbury's, a partner at Dewsbury's, rang me and said, "Can you come and do for us what you did for Ernst & Young? You know, wake us up and teach us how to do technology." I said, "Sure." And a short while after that, of course, we realised that one of the major growing markets was outsourcing. Dewsbury's was not doing any outsourcing. So I said, fine, if we're not doing it, let's be the gamekeeper rather than the poacher.
Sure.
So the idea was to set Dewsbury's up as the organisation that would monitor outsourcing contracts and help companies move into outsourcing without being tainted by the fact that every other one of the big 8 or 10 that there were in those days was actually in the outsourcing business. So, and to do that, of course, we needed a methodology. So found a guy at the Australian Defence Force Academy called Ed Lewis. Very nice fella, member of ACS, by the way. And Ed had been doing some work on structuring of outsourcing and how to do selection properly. And I said, so I met with Ed and said, look, we need to systematise this. Instead of just having a theory or a book on how to do it, we need a technology to support it. So we developed something called Outright, which was how to do outsourcing properly. And it's basically a series of interlinked spreadsheets working on a very simple concept of a bill of material process that's been around for years in manufacturing and logistics, but applying that to outsourcing. And so going, okay, what are you going to outsource? If you're going to outsource a process, then a process has components consisting of people's time, equipment, and consumables. So you tally those up, work out what they cost, and that gives you a baseline costing in order to do outsourcing. If you can't do it cheaper than that, it's a waste of bloody time. Very simple precept. Happened to win an Australian Design Award with it. One of the first Australian Design Awards for software. And so it's got Dewsbury's on the bottom there. Dewsbury's, of course, then immediately merged with Deloitte about 6 months later. And, of course, so that quietly got sidelined because Deloitte, of course, were far more interested in selling outsourcing than selling the monitoring of it. But, so it just went on the shelf on my wall. And we moved on. I did get invited to quite a lot of conferences and things during this period. One of the big ones was the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences, where I had the joy of appearing on the same panel as Trevor Pearcey and Sir Frank Espy and a few other pretty senior honchos. And at my then age, I was definitely the youngest guy in the room. And of course, I had grown a moustache to make myself look older. And I'm very pleased to say that it's worked. I'm now looking a lot older than I did before I had a moustache. So that's really good. So I grew a beard to even enhance it. So anyway, so that was that sort of part of it. And then I got a little bit bored, so I decided to start the Pearcey Foundation. That started because The Age published an obituary of Trevor Pearcey. And it was about a half page. Right next to it was a double-page spread about Bill Gates. Now, Bill Gates wasn't even a glint in his father's eye when Trevor Pearcey designed CIRAC. And I thought, this is bloody ridiculous. We need to start recognising our Australian heroes. So I rang John Costello, who was at that stage the editor of, I think, Computer Weekly in those days, before he went to Computer World.
Yeah.
John Guider was, of course, at the AAA and president of the AI and remembered me from the old sales tax days.
Yeah.
And Phil Steele was the Victorian chair of the ACS.
Right.
So I basically rang them all up, blackmailed them, and said, look, I'm putting $1,000 on the table.
Yeah.
You three, cough up $1,000 each,
Yeah.
and we'll kick off the PSC Foundation.
Yeah.
So that's how it started.
So which year was that?
Oh, God, I can't remember. At least 20 years ago.
Right. Okay.
So I ran PSC for its first 8 years. I recruited Wayne in about year 5, I think. And Wayne, of course, has carried on brilliantly ever since and expanded it and made it bigger and better than I ever could have done.
Yeah.
But as I say, the original idea was I'm fed up with seeing some imported American given the credit for our bloody industry when we've got our own pioneers. And it wasn't just Trevor PSC, of course.
Sure.
And one of the great things was gradually persuading the rest of the industry and profession, both the AAA and the ACS, have each supported PSC events over the years because we had no money, we couldn't do anything. And the first recipient of the PSC medal was Peter Jones. I deliberately made sure it was done at an AAA function in Sydney, but it was an ACS guy who got it.
Right.
And the other, the minor speaker at that same event, it was quite interesting actually, the AAA guy kept on coming to me and trying to cut down the length of my speech. So I started off, I was given a quarter of an hour, and by the time I actually got up onto the podium, I'd only got 9 minutes to do the whole bloody speech.
Yeah.
The other speaker was a chap you may have heard of, who at that stage was chairman of the Australian Republican movement. And so Malcolm Turnbull pinched some of my time.
Right.
Because he wanted to talk longer.
Yeah.
The interesting thing was he got polite applause, I got a standing ovation.
Right.
Because the message I was selling to the assembled people there from the AAA and the ASS was what they wanted to hear.
Sure.
We want to recognise our Australian heroes.
Yeah.
Pete Jones got it, very, very popular recipient. And we've gone on, PSC Foundation has gone on since then to recognise a hell of a lot of people, both through the medal for outstanding lifetime achievement and also through the Young Achiever Awards. The first recipient of that, not the first one, no, I think the third recipient in Victoria was Rick Harvey, who you probably know, FACS, a strong supporter of the ACS for years.
Yeah.
And a lot of the recipients have gone on to bigger and better things. Like, for instance, PSC recognised the founders of Canva 5 years before they did anything.
Yeah.
So I think, that's a good legacy to have. I actually stepped down from the chairmanship of the PSC Foundation because I wanted to stand for the presidency of the ACS.
Right.
First time round.
Okay.
And it was obviously completely impossible for me to hold both roles. And so I took the approach of thinking, well, I will vacate one position in order to be able to compete for the other.
Sure.
So I ran the first time round, got nailed. I counted upon a couple of supports from people who told me they'd given me their support. My main opponent at the time obviously offered better inducements and got elected.
Right.
It was a nasty campaign.
Oh, okay. Yeah. What year was that?
Can't remember now, too long ago.
Right. Okay.
Well, Kuma Parakala won.
Right. Okay.
Right. I was thinking of running a second time. That was 11 years ago, 12 years ago. And that's when I got diagnosed with cancer in October. And the elections were in November.
Right.
So I immediately withdrew. I remember phoning Sam Burrell, telling him I was pulling out.
Yeah.
I rang Brenda Ainsley, who was the main competitor that year, and sent her all my material and said, look, this is what I was going to say I was going to do. I hope some of it is useful to you. Unfortunately, of course, I recovered from cancer. Brenda contracted it while as ACS president, and she died. I didn't.
Yeah.
I remember speaking at her wake in Melbourne and saying I was sure there were some people who wished that I'd won and she'd lost and
Yes.
gone the other way around.
Yes.
She was a great loss.
Right.
Lovely person.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's interesting in ACS competitive positions. Sometimes you're competing against somebody who you're perfectly happy to lose to because you know they'll do a damn fine job.
Yeah.
I mean, I ran for Veep at one stage against Jim Ellis.
Yes.
I remember standing up there and saying, well, you know, you've got two grey-haired gentlemen, both born in England, both of whom will give their all for the ACS. So your choice is to vote for the Victorian or the West Australian.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought that was perfectly fine because it's a privilege to lose to someone like Jim.
Yeah.
There are other times when I know friends of mine have run for other positions in the ACS for which I thought they were extremely well suited, and they've been beaten by people who've then been dilettante in their duties or failed to deliver what they should have done. I think it's I think as Winston Churchill once said, democracy is a flawed system, but it's probably the best we've got.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I did do in the ACS though, and Anthony Wong and I basically inspired to do this, and that was to change the voting system for Congress and Council.
Right.
From the skewed vote that had been in place since the merger of the state societies.
Right.
To essentially a one man, one vote.
Right.
Even though it diminished the power of New South Wales and Victoria, because prior to that point, New South Wales and Victoria just used to carve everything up.
Funny enough, I interviewed Nick Tate last week and discussed exactly that. Yes, the weighted voting system.
Yes, well, it was done in order to persuade the large states to come into the power. I mean, it was reminiscent of the deal to form the Federation of Australia, where New South Wales wouldn't come in unless the capital was no more than, was it one day's horse ride from Sydney?
Yeah, yes.
Which is why it's moved from Albury to Canberra in the first place. So, the same sort of snotty attitude applied at this particular stage. And luckily, Anthony was far-sighted enough to see that it was actually to the advantage of the ACS to have national reach and for the smaller states to feel that they had a true voice at the table.
Yeah.
So we barreled that through between us. I mean, I got a little bit of flack from some of my colleagues in Victoria over that.
Sure.
But, I still think it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
What else do you want to do?
So
from there, okay, so once I recovered from cancer, I was a bit bored. We'd already set up the Centre for Innovative Industries Economic Research, and I'd been doing ACS stats compendiums for years. So, in my spare time, of course, I had written a 731-page document for the federal government, which the Libs buried.
Right.
And I remember my first meeting with Steve Conroy. I said to him, "Have you got a copy of that report, because it only came down 6 months ago?"
Yeah.
And he said no, he wasn't allowed to have it because it was considered to be from the previous government.
Oh.
So I said, well, that's interesting, because in fact I kept the copyright in the contract, so I'll give you a copy.
Yeah.
I don't think he ever read it, but it was the best I could do at the time.
Yeah.
But the thematic of this, the words we used were the Australian software industry, globally competitive, domestically undervalued.
Right.
The department tried to get us to take those words out.
Yeah.
And John Horton and I were the two main authors, and we basically said, no, we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
You publish what we wrote, or you can take our names off it.
Yeah.
So anyway, it got published.
Right.
One of the lovely things Graham Phillipson did was write an editorial about it and say it was the most important document that had been written on the software industry in 20 years.
Yeah.
I encouraged everybody to read it. I don't think anybody did, but because it was a bit long.
Yeah.
But the message was essentially that we already had a globally competitive software industry, which we were losing at the time.
Yeah.
So Stats Compendium, the idea behind that was informed policy is usually better policy.
Sure. Absolutely.
People who write policy and programs based on mantras don't win.
Yeah.
And the best example I ever found was a department, DOCITA, Department of Communications, Information Technology, Arts,
Right.
program that they instigated, which was going to fund certain activities within software and services companies. Unfortunately, the descriptor they used for the qualification for the software and services company meant that there wasn't actually a single Australian software and services company that matched those criteria.
Right.
Which was a perfect example of what happens when you write policies and programs when you don't bloody well understand the industry that you're trying to write them for.
Yeah, absolutely.
So SAS Compendium was basically to try and use the best statistics we could get out of the Australian Bureau of Statistics to describe the software industry and profession.
Yeah.
There had been an ABS occasional publication, 81260, which was actually a deep dive into information technology, but because of the cutbacks in budgetary allocations of the ABS, they hadn't been able to continue it.
Yeah.
But I had worked out an extraction technique which allowed us to basically synthesise what they had done.
Right.
And so I'd been running that in my spare time for a while, and that formed the basis of this document. And so what it basically consisted of was the best statistics we could find on ICT employment, ICT industry structures, the ownership aspects, female employment,
Right.
R&D spend, and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So that when the ACS got to the point of developing policies, they had the numbers at their fingertips,
Yes.
whether they liked them or not.
Yeah, sure.
I do remember, however, one particular edition of it where what came out of the data was that the pass rates for international students in ICT were far higher than the pass rates for domestic students.
Oh, okay.
And I made the mistake, of course, of publishing that,
Yeah.
and then had a couple of deans of universities ring me up and abuse me
Yeah.
and say, how dare you publish this information, it's completely wrong. And I said, well, it comes from the Department of Education based upon the returns that your universities send them.
Yeah.
I said, I'm not inventing the data, I'm simply reprinting it in a form that people can understand. Anyway,
Yeah.
ignoring the facts of data is a bloody good way to develop lousy policy,
absolutely.
or to fail to recognise that an issue exists when that issue does exist.
Yeah.
And as I said to one of the deans, well, it may just be that your recruitment of international students is much better than your recruitment of domestic students.
Right.
Maybe you're getting a better coterie. Maybe they're working harder because they happen to pay for it. I said, I don't know what the factors are. All I'm telling you is the outcome. However, the other number that came out of that was the fact that we were growing our industry employment by over 25,000 a year at the time when we were only producing 5,000 graduates a year.
Right.
And so the shortfall was inevitable.
Yeah.
The reason why we had to keep on importing people all the time was because it didn't produce enough.
Sure.
And if you want to build a domestic industry and have a domestically focused profession, full-time migrants are fine,
Yeah.
but temporary migrants are actually a short-term fix that disguises the reality of a skills shortage.
Yeah.
So I'd written a couple of other reports for ACS, one on outsourcing, another one on, we used to do ACS surveys of the members, so we did a couple of the survey analysis reports and a few of those things. So over the years, I think there's probably been about 20 or 30 reports for
And
them.
what did the survey for the members look at?
Len Joynson used to run them when he was employed by the ACS, and then Adam, I can't remember Adam's second name, he ran them as well.
Yeah.
And they basically looked at discriminatory practices,
Right.
employment attitudes, paths to employment paths to growth,
Yeah.
things of that nature. So again, part of ACS informing itself about the matters that were important to their members.
Yeah.
So, excellent way of going about things.
Yeah.
What else have I done? Well, since I recovered from cancer, I've basically retired from full-time work. I mean, we actually wound SEER up on the 31st of the 12th this year.
Okay. Yeah.
Of course, once Digital Pulse started, I wasn't doing the compendium anymore, but
Yeah.
John asked me to keep on advising them, so I've been, up until the last couple of years, I've been involved in every digital pulse since then.
That was John O'Mahony at Deloitte.
At Deloitte, And so that's been interesting.
Yeah.
The other work I've done, I've been working on a number of research projects with Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, with Cancer Council Victoria, with Peter Mack, and I also sit on Safer Care Victoria, Quality and Safety Signals group within the Department of Health, and a few other bits and pieces. We're looking, for example, I mean, one of the interesting ones was Peter Mack looking at a couple of machine learning projects and looking at the whole aspects of the utilisation of artificial intelligence in health and the ethical and governance considerations for that. To which end the interesting situation where University of South Australia just has to rescind doing a project with the Department of Veterans Affairs because nobody bothered to ask the veterans whether they could use their data.
That's right, yes.
Underscored the concept of informed consent,
yes,
which is a discussion I've just been having with Cancer Council Victoria.
Yeah.
So we've got a whole load of new issues that emerge from that sort of process.
Yes.
And I must admit I'm very pleased to see the way in which the Minister Husick has been addressing that issue and obviously receiving some very good advice from the ACS on it. So I'm hopeful that we'll see good legislative governance as well as voluntary governance within the artificial intelligence space, because my personal opinion is just relying on the goodwill of the companies is crap.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that you raised there, and ties in with what you were saying earlier about having the data to back these. So, where do you think the best direction we should be going with policy and developing regulation around this?
Well, two things. One, stay informed. It's really good producing digital pulse, but you've got to actually read it as well.
Yes, absolutely.
You've also got to look at the data behind it. I mean, don't rely just upon the analysis that's been done by the very good people who've been writing it. I mean, that's excellent.
Yes.
But there's always other analysis you can do. Most of the good analysis comes out of correlative data.
Right.
And so you've got to take two different disparate data sets and look at what does that mean.
Yeah.
And nobody knows more about what it means than the people who actually work in that profession.
Yeah.
Because we can look behind the data. An economist might not realise that that particular data actually means something different to what he's interpreting it as.
Sure.
So that's a useful thing to do. I think the other thing is to preempt. It's no good waiting for the government to say to you, well, what should our AI governance regime be? You've got to tell them what you think it should be,
right,
based upon the best available information. And we don't need to necessarily import experts to do that. I was quite interested to see in the cybersecurity space this sort of concept that we have to talk to somebody overseas about cybersecurity when we've had people in Australia who the US Defence Department go and talk to about what they should do.
Yeah.
Some of whom have been ACS members.
Yeah.
And this constant forelock tugging to the internationals is wasteful and it's insulting to our professionals.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we're experts in everything. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't seek international input to supplement what we've got before.
Yeah.
But supplement, don't replace.
Yeah.
Which brings me on to the next element, that if Deloitte had come to talk to me this year, I would have told them would have been the buzz one to look at, and that was technological sovereignty.
Right.
That we've seen multiple versions of definition of that, where the definitions being utilised are mostly to serve the interests of the organisation doing the definition.
Right.
Some people are focused on ownership, some are focused on the location of the development.
Yeah.
My attitude is simple. Technological sovereignty exists where we own, make, support, maintain, and invent, and continue to invent technology. If you miss any of those elements out, it's less technological sovereignty than if it's included.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you can't have a situation where a multinational has a very good development organisation in Australia where using Australian people, developing on Australian soil, great. You also have situations where I've seen in the past where an Australian company wins a project to develop something and then immediately offshores it.
Right. Yeah.
So ownership alone is not the indicator.
Yeah.
Employment of Australians alone is not the indicator. It's sovereignty,
Yeah.
true sovereignty. And true sovereignty means that we have control over the process.
Yeah, which ties into what you were saying earlier in that report of globally competitive but locally undervalued.
Well, you go back to it's actually a security issue.
Sure.
I mean, I think I can now talk about this because enough time's gone past. But many years ago, in a country not far from here, like this one, we imported Leopard tanks from Germany.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we didn't have the software to drive the turrets. So we had these wonderful Leopard tanks that could charge off in various directions, but we couldn't actually point the gun at anything.
Right.
That's an illustration of a lack of technological sovereignty.
Yeah. Yeah. So it must concern you then that the current trend that we've got is pretty well pushing everything onto US-based cloud providers, the Microsofts, the AWSs, and that of the world. Is that a concern?
Yes, it is. I mean, I'm was very pleased to see that Microsoft at least was establishing cloud farms in Australia.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that it was just going off to Reykjavik or Limerick or wherever they've got things overseas.
Yeah.
And there are obviously certain countries where you wouldn't want your data going. I do remember a few years back, the Parliament House email system was basically offshored to a country that probably shouldn't have known what was in the Parliamentary House emails.
Sure.
So, there are security implications to this process as well.
Yeah.
But I see no logical reason why we can't establish our own capacities to do this, and where it is mission critical, or there are security implications, it is always safer to use a local provider.
So, with establishing that local sovereignty, what do you see ACS's, AAA's roles in doing that?
Continually advising government on the implications of not doing it.
Yeah.
And outlining the industry development and economic advantages of doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no reason why, if Australia developed its own cloud farm capability, that it couldn't sell that capacity to some Pacific nations who don't have the capacity to do it, who would feel safe with their data in Australia, or safer than if their data was in Washington or Beijing.
Yep, absolutely.
We are the sixth most important industrial nation in the world, and we hide our light under a bushel, and the bushel is usually made of wheat.
Right. Yeah.
We're still assuming that we ride to prosperity on a sheep's back. Guess what? We don't. Look at the bloody numbers. We are a service economy. We have strong mining industry. We have strong agricultural industries.
Yeah.
But we also have extremely strong service industries, and one of them is the information technology industry.
Yeah. So what would be your advice to somebody young coming into the industry today?
Don't believe the bullshit.
Right.
If somebody says you can't do it, do it.
Well, on that, Ian, I think I thank you very much for your time. That's been a very informative, very wide-ranging conversation, and hopefully we can do it again. Thank you.
My pleasure, Paul.